Hey everyone. So today we're going to do a deep dive into therapy, mental health, gender, eating disorder recovery, and more. I have the wonderful pleasure of being joined here today by Asher Panjiris. They are a psychotherapist who specializes in providing gender and sexuality affirming care for individuals struggling with eating disorders, trauma, chronic health concerns, work-life balance concerns, and more. They received a Master's of Arts in Visual and Critical Studies in 2007 and a Master's of Social Work from Smith College in 2013. They are also a co-director of the Kintsugi Therapist Collective and provide group therapy, individual therapy, and consultation services. They're a podcaster and creator of the Living in This Queer Body project. So today, Asher and I are going to talk a little bit about their journey into doing this work and what their work looks like. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Asher.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for getting in touch with me.
Of course. So kind of just starting out big picture, could you tell us just a little bit about yourself, your life path, and what brought you to the field of mental health?
Sure. Yeah. Um, I I've actually been thinking about this a lot because um, some of my like health issues that I struggle with, have been coming up pretty strongly in the past couple of years. And so it's led me to think about like, how did I get here? Like how did I get here professionally? And like, what's the core of like why I do this work? Because I've had to make some changes in my practice. And so I guess that's all to say this has been on my mind. I did not start out a career wanting to be a social worker necessarily. I actually went to graduate school for art and really thought I was going to be a video artist and a professor and, follow a path towards that. And while I was in art school, I really connected with sort of psychoanalytic literature and how you can kind of use that to analyze and understand more deeply films. So I was really interested in film study, and I think the reason I bring that up is just that introduction to the idea of really understanding something on a much deeper level, thinking about the very complex world of the unconscious, and felt extremely compelling to me. I think probably in retrospect, it feels compelling to me because I grew up in very religious environment as a little repressed queer non-binary person in a family with a lot of secrets. And so there was a lot of kind of and I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease when I was 14. So I had a lot of questions about like my body and why it was chronically ill, and my sexuality and abuse history and family history and all of these things. So I think for me, there was just so much that felt about my psychological beginnings that felt really confusing. And I really was compelled to kind of like plunge into the depths and try to understand both myself and also, I think, help other people find ways to tell their stories in a more kind of full and coherent way, not in such a narrow way. And so that's sort of what brought me to studying clinical social work, and wanting to work directly with clients. And so I guess how I became sort of more specialized,
Mhm.
is that I was working at a residential eating disorder facility called Castlewood Treatment Center years ago, prior to getting my degree. So I was kind of like a frontline worker, doing a lot of direct support for people who were experiencing pretty much all of the things you mentioned in the intro. They were, really in very medically dangerous, acute places with disordered eating. They were also, a lot of them, all of them had experienced extremely complex trauma in their lives. And there were quite a few people, and this was years ago, and it was definitely a time when, I mean, it's still a really difficult world to receive adequate care, but there were lots of queer and trans and non-binary folks who I particularly connected with, who were in treatment and were getting really inadequate, misattuned care. And so that became something I was really interested in. And more broadly, I think just the idea of what it means to live in a body that isn't read or understood as coherent to the world around you, even though there is a lot of meaning and coherence within oneself. And so kind of, I'm really interested in that, working with people around that disconnect and trying to address barriers to being able to feel like a, fully sort of realized or embodied human, as much as that's possible in the world that we live in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like a big focus on like trying to help people share their stories in ways that they probably have never had the space to do because of just all of the oppressive systems on like micro and macro levels that they've probably
Definitely.
encountered.
And even be able, I think, when I get really despairing about, the systems, which we all, I'm sure, right now are currently extremely despairing about, safety for many, many bodies. I think something that has been really powerful for me, myself, in my own therapy work, and not all of my therapy experiences, but in some in particular, has been actually just being able to tell my story to myself, like really understand my life in a way that makes sense to me, and understand more about myself. And so I think in these despairing moments, I feel like sometimes that's sort of all I can, help to offer, really, is,
Yeah.
spaces for that to be potentially possible.
Yeah. This might be a broad question to answer, but I'm wondering like how does that look like in terms of your approach to therapy to help create that space, that affirming, inclusive space, especially for like queer and trans clients?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to talk about the way I ideally like to work without talking about how inaccessible it often is. And I think, I've worked in, doesn't mean I've worked in community mental health settings. I've worked in residential treatment. I've worked in inpatient units. I think that all of these spaces are spaces where we can approach a person who is suffering, especially, like, let's say in this case, most of my clients are queer, trans, and non-binary, chronically ill, kind of all of those sort of disabled. I think all of those settings can potentially offer space for people to kind of connect with with much deeper parts of themselves. But the way most of those kind of settings are structured, it really requires you to adhere, as you probably know, and lots of people listening probably know, to kind of a more of a behavioral model, right? And this is
Yeah.
coming up particularly right now with all of these, anti-trans legislation, where mental health is being framed as certainly a gatekeeping space, but also space where there are these like rubrics for being able to assess things that are, ridiculous. It's ridiculous to try to assess someone's readiness to be themselves.
Right.
It's ridiculous. And we all, I think everyone listening knows that. But I do think it's important to just say that I do often think about it as longer term work. I think that really in my practice, I try to provide a space where there can be, even with the urgency of kind of the demands of the world around you, there can be a space for sort of like a slow unfolding of making sense of your inner world. And I think it takes a long time to sort of, you know, address the practical things that one is suffering with. Like most people come to me not because they're like, I'm queer, that's a problem. You know, they come to me because they're like going through a breakup or, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
And so I think that, which is, you know, all of these legislative bodies really don't understand that either. But my work is really trying to help people understand more deeply why, you know, a loss, for instance, is so painful, right? Like a breakup is so painful. And part of that is really addressing like early attachment relationships and extremely painful things about one's past. And it's not all just like, you know, talking about your parents and caregivers. It's, you know, it's talking about a lot of things. But I think being able to hold space for kind of the enormity of what inner psychic suffering and also, you know, social systems and kind of lead one to be unable to access their choice or unable to access their sense of clarity about themselves, understand how to even develop a sense of intuition, embodied intuition, like what would it look like to actually listen to myself and where is myself, you know, and what gets in the way of knowing where myself is. Those are really important questions. And, you know, it takes time to answer them. And it takes also like trying things out, you know, trying things out in a relationship and then coming back and saying, you know, how did this go? And I think there's a lot of holding also space for grief and mourning, because I think to live as a queer, trans, non-binary person in this world, is unfortunately is a space where there's so much grief and so much mourning of like what isn't possible or what isn't accessible, or what wasn't possible or accessible when we were younger, and you know, like deep grief around all of that. One practical way, I know I'm not exactly talking about what happens in session, but one practical kind of
I know it
framing.
varies greatly from person to
Sure.
person
But
based
I
on how
think
they come in.
exactly. But I think one thing that's like kind of consistent with both the groups that I run and also with my private practice is that I really focus on kind of what I call barriers to nourishment. And so I find that that's a helpful framing for talking about, especially with people who struggle with disordered eating, but, you know, really don't identify with a lot of the kind of conventional stereotypes of having an eating disorder, and also don't necessarily want to address, you know, the behaviors right now, or are fearful about that. And so we, you know, I think talking about barriers to nourishment is a way to incorporate things like how we either often restrict, you know, nourishing experiences in our lives and why that happens, you know, figuring out why that happens, addictive behaviors or disordered eating, working themselves until they can't work anymore. You know, I mean, really punishing behaviors that I think also serve to protect people from more painful emotional truths. And so that framework, I think, is kind of where I often start, because it can be an entry point for people to say, oh yeah, I always forget to eat lunch when I'm at work, or, you know, whatever it is. And those can kind of be entry points to understanding current moment life and also the past and where these kind of messages came from.
Like building insight and what's going on currently, and then what happened that kind of led to this being
like, why is this
the kind of day to day.
Exactly. Why is this such a just default setting, and why is it such a strong impulse, and what is the fear if we let go of this? Because there's definitely something to be afraid of. There are many things to be afraid of, I think, if we
I really like that framework of barriers to nourishment. I haven't heard it like that, and I think that's a really, really helpful and powerful way to think about it.
Yeah.
And that kind of makes me think of, one of the things I wanted to talk about with you a little bit was like kind of your approach to eating disorder treatment. And, I think of a lot of like more typical or traditional approaches to treating eating concerns and disordered eating are often not designed with like queer, trans, and non-binary people in mind. So I was wondering, if you could speak to like what some of those typical concerns are in more traditional models and maybe like how your approach maybe helps create a more inclusive approach to how we think about food and eating and bodies.
Mhm.
I know that's kind of a big question, but
No, it's something I certainly have thought and written about quite a bit. I think that, as I said, I've worked in kind of more formal eating disorder treatment. I was actually a director of an outpatient eating disorder treatment facility in Manhattan. Um, so I know from the inside out kind of what's going wrong. First, it the reason that often that queer and trans bodies are not supported in conventional eating disorder treatments is that kind of concerns around the intersection of gender dysphoria, trauma, other things like neurodivergence, or any number of other specific things, but there isn't a lot of concern or thought about, again, why a person would have a hard time getting into a more balanced relationship with nourishment. And there are many trauma informed clinicians who are working in the field of eating disorders, but most treatments are really focused on behavioral interventions and building up a kind of stamina for being able to tolerate discomfort. So altering an eating behavior, a pattern like binging or purging, kind of addressing what is wrong about those behaviors and offering a kind of prescriptive path forward, and often that's framed as like intuitive eating or, these things that have a lot of potential. These frameworks have a lot of potential, but they really are kind of so overused at this point that they really don't mean anything, honestly. It's like, so I think that a big part of the issue is how people are looking at the actual behaviors as like the behaviors are problematic, not the, world in which this person is living or the family
right.
system in which this person is living. So that's one thing. And I think for me, particularly around kind of gender, I really see so many trans non-binary folks who are feeling like they have no other options for addressing body dissatisfaction. And I think one of the really powerful ways is through, restriction and maintenance of food. And that can help certain people achieve a sense of kind of more alignment gender wise. And yet the reality is that, the cost of that can be really high. Cost can be, at worst, someone becomes extremely medically unstable and then needs to enter into a system that really will not treat them well. Or, kind of almost similarly as concerning is being in a place where they aren't able to actually appreciate having entered into a space where they feel, kind of more themselves in their bodies because they're like so preoccupied, so anxious, so fixated on food and exercise and, avoiding purging, but ending up purging or ending up binging because all of these food behaviors eventually, I mean, this is my take, but all of these kind of controlling behaviors all fold in on themselves. So nobody is just restricting. Nobody is just binging. Nobody is just, if you're binging, you're restricting. If you're restricting, you inevitably binge. Like there is no getting out of that cycle. So it's an incredibly stressful cycle. And it doesn't really allow someone to kind of almost like appreciate what they're trying to achieve, essentially. And so often I'll see people who, like can't afford to get gender affirming, surgeries. And in the meantime, while they're saving up, they're doing a lot of self-harming behaviors in order to survive, to really feel like they can emotionally survive their life. And so it's a lot to ask someone who's, really doing this for survival to stop doing this,
Right.
to implement a plan. Here's the, food diary, and here's the dietitian, and let's fix this, right? Because there isn't really an incentive, and so I think it's very difficult. And I'm really grateful and lucky to, work with a lot of dietitians who are in alignment with me in terms of an approach, like a slow approach, a kind of harm reduction approach, an approach that helps people kind of make shifts and changes that might increase their quality of life while still being tolerable enough emotionally that they can kind of handle if their bodies are changing slightly, and what help they need to be able to tolerate that, whether it be like more community or, more like-minded people. I mean, I know that the organization Fed Up is doing amazing work with kind of peer support and all sorts of things, connecting people, queer, trans, non-binary folks to others. And they have a very much, I think, like a harm reduction approach, and are really critical of, the conventional treatment structures. And I, agree with them. And so I'm grateful for organizations like that who really, I think, are trying to address holistically what is at issue here. It's not just a failure of the individual. It's not that the individual trans identified person can't control their food intake. And they just woke up one day and decided like, this is what they're going to do. Right. It's like,
It's much more complicated
it's
than
so
that.
much more complicated. It's so much more complicated. And I think just being with folks, being in conversation with folks who know it's much more complicated than that, and are curious about how that feels for someone. So I think that's my approach. I mean, I definitely collaborate with other people. I don't think that someone can come to me and resolve all of their issues. And I think that's true of anything, but
yeah, I definitely hear this like complexity piece coming through, and like I think I really like emphasizing it's not a failure of the individual. Like one of the ways I sometimes think of it is like it's the individual just reacting in any way they can to a series of systems that have failed them. And they're just trying to survive, like you're saying. It brings me back to that, like I think that idea of control that is often thought about, especially within the context of eating disorders. And just how like this world is like chaotic and out of control and oppressive and damaging, and it's my body's the only thing I feel like I can control. And
if that, I mean,
if
I think
that,
that's, I
or
think
that's
that's
at least the idea.
that's the idea. And I think the really heartbreaking thing is when some people come to me and feel as if they have been trying to find refuge or solace in what they can control. And because of wellness culture, because of, these ideas of the individual, like the morality of your, if you're a thin, white, person that lives on one end of the binary, then you are morally superior, essentially, to someone who has a different shaped body or different, whatever. And so those forces sometimes make it just impossible for someone to really feel like, oh, I'm in control. Like it's almost like there's no way to feel in control. And I think that's the heartbreaking moment that a lot of people come to me saying like, I've been trying this, I've been punishing my body, but also trying to help my body and try to help my mental health, and none of it's it's just like none of it's working, right? It's
Yeah.
all in every direction, things are not working. And it's hard for me as a clinician to in some ways agree with them that, I'm like, I can't say, oh, you just turn here to this, this safe space or this safe space. Like you've got it all
Mhm.
wrong. The world is safe for you. I can't exactly do that. So we have to come up with strategies together that make life feel more bearable and potentially, have moments of ease and contentment.
Yeah. So, kind of my next question, like some of this can, I think, already be gleaned from what you've shared, but I'm wondering, like, what advice would you give to queer and trans and non-binary people that are specifically looking for resources and counseling related to disorder eating? Like
Mm-hmm.
maybe thinking of like what should they look for to help determine whether or not like a therapist is a good affirming fit for them, whether that's, with you or with anyone else.
Yeah. Again, I will just mention Fed Up because getting, they're really developing a lot of resource bases. So there are lots of lists of clinicians and dietitians who they're aligned with health at every size. They're aligned with a lot of the more welcoming and disability justice informed and non-carceral informed treatment approaches to disordered eating and to mental health. And so that's one place. I think there are things to look out for. So like red flags would be a therapist or a dietitian who in your local community, let's say, who works with people with, specializes in working with disordered eating and who talks maybe a lot about wellness or,
Mhm.
really vaguely about like intuitive eating or, things that sound potentially okay, but
Yeah.
I really would encourage people to talk to that person and ask specific questions. And sometimes it's hard to know what those specific questions should be, but ask maybe specific questions like, if I enter into treatment with you, do you have an approach to, um, you know, certain behaviors? Do you like, is it okay if I'm not in a place yet to want to start or to stop, purging or binging? Like if I want to stop binging, but I don't know how, and I'm not sure I can, or, like what is because I think that will give you a sense of how this provider, how tolerant they would be of this longer unfolding process. That
Yeah.
the real question, I think, for a lot of people who are entering into treatment is what might happen to me, essentially. Like if I need a higher level of care, I think there's a big fear for a lot of people. Once they are starting to seek treatment, they're already in a place where their life is pretty unmanageable, right? They're
Hmm.
not just like, oh, I'm a little concerned. Am I restricting too much? It's like
Yeah.
you're coming in a pretty scared place
Hmm.
often. And so asking questions about, like, what if I do need a higher level of care? How would I know that? And how would we assess that? I do think taking a look at who this provider is and just and trust your instinct, but also get clear on what you are looking for. I do worry about, and maybe this is, showing my age a bit, but I do worry about specifically with eating disorders, what is happening on TikTok and what
Hmm.
is happening in on social media, because I do think with disordered eating specifically, there is a lot of overlap around kind of lifestyle
Hmm.
advice around eating, wellness. Some messaging can be really harmful for people who are already in a struggle with like
Hmm.
hating their bodies and um So I don't know. That's a larger question for me. I don't think it's something for any individual person who's struggling to solve, but
Sure.
just like some caution. And particularly, this could be, advice for someone who has a loved one or like someone in their community who they're really worried about, kind of just trying to be a little skeptical about maybe some of the things that they're seeking out in terms of advice. And I think peer support groups are really great,
Yeah.
especially when you're not maybe ready to address your behaviors, but that something maybe not be right is not right. And yeah, you don't have to want to change and you
Hmm.
don't have to get advice. You can just be scared and be
Yeah.
overwhelmed. And I think I wish there were more of those, but they do exist. So I would look for peer run disordered eating support groups.
It's like be a space where people can just feel supported, validated, be
Yeah.
accepted for where they are at in their process.
And try
Yeah.
out, I think there's something
Hmm.
about trying out with other people questions like, what would it be like if I decided to get a therapist?
Yeah.
Like, have you done that yet? That
Hmm.
really, I think, makes a big difference. It's really hard to work with people who come to me who feel like they had to come to me, right? Whose family members said, like, I'm not paying for college or something unless you go to treatment. And it has a different feel when folks are showing up because they kind of are ready to like maybe welcome some support, not
Right.
necessarily some behavioral change, but just
Hmm.
welcome in like, oh yeah, I can talk about this once a
Yeah.
week.
And like just opening up the door.
Just a little. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And those pieces you talk about, like general or vague approach to like wellness, just, I don't know, as you're talking, maybe think of like, of course it's helpful to like consider like how do we target like helping people be healthy and reduce like harm. But like I feel like the kind of idea of like vague approaches to intuitive eating and changing things like very quickly almost feels like we're just like slapping a band-aid
Mm-hmm.
and not understanding, like you're saying, like what is actually going on. We're just kind of seeing the surface day to day, but we're not fixing what's actually or helping or understanding or treating what's actually causing that,
Mm-hmm.
which might be helpful in the short term, but I think harmful in the long term.
Yeah. I mean, there's, it's very common for people who go through intensive treatment to quote unquote relapse, right?
Hmm.
Because I mean, especially disordered eating. I just want to say this as to anyone who's listening who's struggling is like, we have to eat to stay alive. So
Right.
you can try to abstain from certain behaviors, but that's different. And so you're always exposed to this kind of necessity or this demand. And so it really is something that has to get addressed from the, kind of ground level, because otherwise it's very easy to just fall back into certain ways of managing things. And
Absolutely.
that's okay if you're one of those people because it's so
Yeah.
normal. It's like almost inevitable in a
Hmm.
way.
Yeah, really here again, that piece of like not demonizing or pathologizing
Catholicism.
the
That's right.
individual for
That's right.
just
That's right.
acknowledging the complexity of everything that's going on and
Yeah.
encouraging compassion for where they're at in their process. I'm wondering, kind of like as maybe a final question or two, are there any like other important pieces, other aspects of your work, projects you're working on that we haven't really touched on that you feel would
Yeah.
be important to mention?
Sure. Well, like I said at the beginning, because I've been going through some kind of deeper health challenges, I have several chronic illnesses. And so I've been over the past couple of years dealing with that. And it's led me um, to focus my work a little differently.
Mhm.
One of the things that I've done over the past, I don't know, I think I had my anniversary yesterday for maybe the fourth year. I have a podcast called Living in the Square Body, and I interview a lot of people who are interested, very interesting, who talk about how to live in their bodies, live
Mhm.
in queer bodies. And that has been really helpful to me as an individual and hopefully to other people. But so I do that. I have a podcast, and that feels very nourishing, to use that word. It feels very nourishing for me as someone who has a complex relationship with my own body, being chronically ill. And the other thing that I have, the other big projects I've started over the past year and a half is the Kintsugi Therapist Collective. And it is I'm the co-director, and we work with clinicians, we kind of broadly open it up to care workers who work in the mental health field. So whether that's, a dietitian, a nurse practitioner, a body worker, therapist, anyone who's kind of working in trauma informed care and wants to and feels frankly burnt out and unsupported by systems that don't really prioritize the well-being of care providers. And this is particularly potent after, as the pandemic has worn on. There are a lot of therapists and care providers who are leaving the field. And so we're kind of trying to catch people as they're, considering leaving, or they're beginning to be burnt out. And we offer some retreats, and also a year-long program for really addressing how to sustainably approach this work in this world that we live in right now. And it's not easy, but I think talking about community, it's bringing together a bunch of people who are sort of trying to address that problem together. And so that's been really, again, that also has been really nourishing for me, because I'm one of those clinicians who really has struggled with those questions. And I think it makes our field stronger to really care for the care workers, essentially.
It can be easy to forget that piece.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, just as a final question, if someone were looking to get to know more about you, looking to get to know more about like the services you provide, some of these projects, how would they find out more? How would they get in contact with you?
Yeah. Well, the easiest way is, if you're on Instagram, you can go to Living in This Queer Body, all one, at Living in This Queer Body. And that links you to my work, the podcast, and a bunch of, interviews I've done, writing I've done. And you can also go to my website. It's asherpanjiris.com. And you can learn a lot about, the groups I'm running, and the occasional individual openings that I have in my practice.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll be sure to put all that down in the description below so people can easily find out more.
Yeah, I love hearing from people, and love, connecting folks to other clinicians if I can.
So that's all the questions I have. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Asher. This is wonderful. And I hope it was helpful and informative for all the people who will end up watching this. As always, thank you everyone so much for watching. Be sure to like and share and subscribe with anybody you think might also benefit from content like this. My cat Tipsy and I love and support and appreciate all of your support. And again, thank you to Asher, and bye for now.